Hola mi gente, welcome back to the Mano Podcast. I'm George Laws Garcia, Executive Director of the Puerto Rico Statehood Council.
And I'm Martín, Rivera, Director of Advocacy. On today's episode, we wish to update our listeners about the budget reconciliation process in Congress and its potential impact on the island in terms of healthcare, tax incentives, and nutrition programs.
Additionally, we want to discuss recent comments by both Puerto Rico's governor and resident commissioner regarding the issue of Puerto Rico's political status. We'll also analyze Congressman Pablo José Hernández's reluctance to address the political status of Puerto Rico and his intention to refound his political party on the island. We also greatly appreciate all of the comments and questions that you leave on our videos and all of our content. So we want to take some time today in a mailbag section to answer some of your questions and give you our responses.
So let's get started.
All right, Martín. So can you give us an update about what's happening in Congress and how it impacts Puerto Rico?
Of course. Well, the budget reconciliation process is ongoing. There's been several markups already, but this week marked the three biggest committees that impact Puerto Rico. That's the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the House Ag Committee, and the House Ways and Means Committee. For Energy and Commerce, that deals directly with Medicaid. The Ag Committee obviously deals with nutrition programs such as SNAP, but for Puerto Rico is the NAP program or the PAN program. And for Ways and Means, that's the committee that will be in charge of any tax incentives that might come out of this budget reconciliation process.
So what happened?
They had over this Wednesday. All three committees had their markups, which went overnight. That showed the amount of amendments on this issue because the budget reconciliation process, this proposal is going to hold a lot of the priorities of the Trump administration, that they want to do several cuts on several programs nationwide.
And cuts on taxes. This is Trump's big, beautiful bill.
Exactly. And the main reason why the budget reconciliation process is so important is because they don't have to meet the 60-vote threshold in the Senate. So it makes it easier to pass this legislation with less votes, and it carries a lot of the priorities of the president.
If they can get it done.
If they can get it done. There's still a couple of hurdles because even though they had overnight markups, after each of these committees go, all the markups for all the committees of jurisdiction then have to go to the Budget Committee. After the Budget Committee, then it has to go to the Rules Committee before it goes to the floor. There could still be a manager's amendment in the Rules Committee that completely changes the bill, and then it goes to the floor. And then the Senate at the same time is already saying that they don't like the current bills that come out of markup, so they want to make changes themselves. So then it comes back to the House.
Yeah, it's complicated. It's complicated.
It's a long process. Speaker Johnson said that he wants to have a deadline, have something out of the House for the first step before Memorial Day, so that's next week.
Okay.
It's an uphill climb, but we'll see what happens.
So you've given us an overview of the kind of big picture of the budget reconciliation process and everything that's going on there. How did the committees of jurisdiction deal with the issues directly impacting Puerto Rico?
So for Puerto Rico, there was some good news in regards to, because there are several cuts being proposed to Medicaid, SNAP.
For all states at the national level.
For all states at the national level. Luckily, at this time, Puerto Rico is not going to receive any cuts. And the difference is because Puerto Rico is treated differently from several other programs stateside. For example, for SNAP, for the PAN program or the NAP program, they receive a block grant. Similarly for Medicaid. The Medicaid, the current funding that's been allocated for Puerto Rico ends in 2027. So for now, until 2027, when we face that cliff, Puerto Rico's funding of its Medicaid program and its PAN program are going to stay the same.
So part of what I think is interesting about this is that they're proposing cuts in these programs nationally. But Puerto Rico gets treated separately as a territory, and we already have cuts that have been put in place because when we're treated separately, we're treated unequally and below the national average for these programs.
And we have to meet different benchmarks that states don't have to.
Exactly.
So we have bigger benchmarks. We don't have assured funding after a certain period. At least for right now in the budget reconciliation process, the current funding that's been allocated for Puerto Rico to 2027 remains. But we're still facing that cliff coming up because we are a territory and we're not going to be treated the same as states.
Yeah.
Luckily, at this time, because we're not being treated the same as states, we're not getting a cut at this moment. But it does still face that cliff come in the future.
And here's a question for me out of curiosity to see if you know. even with the proposed cuts that the Republican majority in Congress is putting forward for both Medicaid and nutritional assistance, Puerto Rico's treatment as a territory that's separate and unequal, would we, if we were treated as a state, still be receiving more even with those proposed cuts?
Well, with those proposed cuts, again, it's still ongoing proposals. They haven't finished. But then Puerto Rico's, if Puerto Rico were a state, in terms of Medicaid alone, it would be based on the poverty level of the island, not based on the estimated amount. Because right now, come 2027, for example, the federal matching rate, that's what the federal government provides into the Medicaid program, right now it's at 76%. If it was based on statute, without the current elevated levels of funding, it would go down to 55%.
Wow.
Additionally, on the block grant, I believe Puerto Rico is supposed to receive, prior to the allocation of the funds that they have now, it's supposed to receive $365 million, I believe, when in reality, the Puerto Rico's Medicaid program, it actually, the expenses, what is actually allocated for 2027 is $3.8 billion.
Wow.
So that shows you the difference on what Puerto Rico's entitled as a territory and the actual need on the island.
Yeah.
Again, for the moment, until this current funding runs out, Puerto Rico is going to be treated with a 76% FMAP, with close to $3.5 to $4 billion per year, which is the actual cost of the program, but that's not secured after 2027. For the moment, we're stable, but again, the realities of being a territory still leaves us in that long-term limbo that we don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, and that's something that obviously impacts our healthcare system, but it impacts hospitals, it impacts healthcare providers, and unfortunately, until Puerto Rico finishes its territory status or Congress gives us some kind of fix for this particular item, we're kind of stuck in this situation.
Yeah.
All right. So what about? So we talked about Medicare and nutrition. What about the tax component of this?
So House Ways and Means deals with like I mentioned, all the tax incentives, and I know there were two previous proposals that would have incentivized manufacturing in Puerto Rico.
Yep.
I believe it was by Rep. Militakis from New York. I believe the other one was the MEDS Act, which was actually introduced last Congress by our current governor, former resident commissioner, and then there was another legislation that had some issues with it.
The supply chain security legislation.
Could you elaborate a little bit on that, on the differences on the two proposals? Because they both had to deal with manufacturing, but there was a significant difference on how they achieved that goal.
Yeah. So it's interesting because earlier this year, the two pieces of legislation were presented. The first one really dealt with providing Puerto Rico and the other territories an incentive for manufacturing, but it was based on the possessions tax credit. So the fact that Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory was the legal avenue through which the tax credit could be applied to the island, which basically created a situation where if you use that, it applied to the island, and then manufacturing facilities come to the island using that, it basically creates a disincentive for any change in political status, because if Puerto Rico changes to, let's say, statehood, then it would automatically lose the capacity for companies that are operating there to continue receiving this tax credit.
So it would have created an incentive to maintain the current territory status.
Correct. Yeah, that's right. And that's originally the proposal that was supported by our current resident commissioner, Pablo José Hernández, and some of his allies in Congress. Now, after conversations with Governor González Colón, Representative Militakis, who had introduced this, decided to introduce the MEDS Act, which is also an incentive for manufacturing, but instead of being done in a way that applies only to territories, it was done in a way that applies to all jurisdictions nationally that meet certain economic distress thresholds, right? And obviously in Puerto Rico, that would apply to us because as a territory, we have a significant level of economic distress across many of the census tracts on the island. But it would also mean that it would apply to other jurisdictions stateside that also have similar conditions.
That meet the criteria.
Exactly. And it would also mean that if manufacturing companies in Puerto Rico took advantage of that or came to the island and used that tax credit, if the island changed its political status in the future, then that tax credit wouldn't automatically go away. So it wouldn't trap Puerto Rico in a circumstance of being stuck in the territory status in order to not lose this incentive for its manufacturing industry.
Of course, and so it wouldn't stymie the efforts to resolve Puerto Rico's status issue, and also would preserve those economic development tools.
Exactly.
As Puerto Rico recovers from its economic troubles in the past and goes forward to actually build the incentives that is required to bring back manufacturing to the island.
Exactly. So, Martín, I think that the biggest deal for me with this whole budget reconciliation process is that there's a huge amount of policies that are being impacted by this. And because we're a territory, we don't actually have a full say in this. Our resident commissioner can give his opinion. He can go on the floor. He can deliver floor speeches. But at the end of the day, we don't get any actual votes on the floor on this issue in the House. And then on top of that, in the Senate, we have zero say as to what happens.
And I'll even add a little bit to that, because if you think about it, we have one non-voting resident commissioner who's limited to 2 committees.
Yep.
So basically, as I mentioned, several of the committees of jurisdiction have had their markups. House Natural Resources, where the resident commissioner sits, had their markup. But there are several other committees that if we had a delegation, we would have members actively introducing amendments, actually moving the legislation forward, preventing things that might harm the island.
Yeah.
But we don't have that voice, even in the committees, because we only have one non-voting member that will not even end up voting for the final package when it gets to the floor.
And that's why it's so essential that whatever happens, we actually address the core issue of Puerto Rico, which is its territorial inequality. And the territorial inequality goes to all the programs that you talk to, healthcare, nutrition, all of those things, treatment under the tax code. But it also goes to the democratic deficit, which is the lack of capacity to have a full voice and say in the federal institutions that are passing the laws that we live under. So what has happened on the status issue?
So a few updates on the status issues. So this week, Governor Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon was in D.C. She was here for the Select USA Summit, which is focused on the reshoring efforts, build in the USA, and obviously Puerto Rico being a U.S. territory. It applies to us as well. Her and her delegation also had additional meetings, speaking of budget reconciliation, making sure that the funds that have already been appropriated to Puerto Rico are still allocated to Puerto Rico from the budget reconciliation process, and also for disaster relief, all these issues. But there was a question presented to her this week in regards to status. Her representative states that we are evaluating the different strategies in Congress, but that the governor has not specified when her allies will present a bill to make Puerto Rico the 51st state in this session. Could you speak about that, George? Because that doesn't mean necessarily that the status issue is dead. Yeah. It's just that, like, literally right now, here in D.C., it's budget reconciliation.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that we have to, make sure that our audience is aware of. Just because there isn't immediate action happening right now, and because the governor is also meeting on other issues, it doesn't mean that the issue is dead, that it's not going to move forward. That's just not the case. The reality is that right now in Congress, there is an almost laser-like focus on what is going to happen in the budget reconciliation process. So the governor's addressing the issue that members of Congress are focused on right now at this moment. She continues to advance the issue of Puerto Rico's status and is working to educate and inform both our existing allies as well as the new members of Congress that just came in earlier this year. And when the right window of opportunity comes, all of that will come together. And hopefully we will have a package of legislation on Puerto Rico's political status. We just need to be patient with the legislative process, which right now is focused on these other bigger picture things that are happening with regards to taxes, federal cuts to different programs, and all these other areas where we need to make sure that Puerto Rico's interests are also taken into account.
Right. But on that same note, the resident commissioner, Pablo José Hernández, has also spoken about status recently. He did say that at this moment, he wasn't going to present any language on how to improve the territorial status or the definition of Commonwealth or the current territory status unless a formal debate begins in Congress. But at the same time, he said that he's looking forward to a proposal for the Refoundation of the Popular Democratic Party. That's his local party in Puerto Rico, which supports the current territory status, which is expected to be ready in 2026. And according to the resident commissioner, it will give the general definition of what it means to be an autonomous. Could you speak a little bit about this? Because to me, it seems that he's playing an old playbook. I believe his grandfather, when he was governor, also didn't make a proposal, but he kept giving big promises about a new version of Commonwealth or ELA or the current territory status that never came to fruition.
Yeah, so, it's interesting, Martín, because it's kind of like we're replaying history here in a lot of ways. The resident commissioner, he's a young guy. He's obviously intelligent and very well spoken. But the reality is, on this issue of Puerto Rico's territorial status, he has 0 degree of commitment to actually resolving this issue and recognizing that it is an issue that not only the majority of voters in Puerto Rico have consistently said that they want addressed, but the majority of Americans and the American public also support a resolution to it as well. And that's deeply disturbing and sad because he continues to tout his own election as evidence that people don't want the issue addressed, when in that same election we saw that voters were given a chance to vote between independence with free association, and statehood, and the overwhelming majority, 58% voted for statehood.
More people voted for statehood than any political candidate on the island,
including
him.
So what's fascinating is the deflection that happens there. So he says, I'm not going to deal with this issue unless it becomes a debate in Congress. But the reality is, the role of a resident commissioner is actually to bring issues that are important to your constituents to Congress. So he's basically abdicating his responsibility to address this issue on behalf of the voters in Puerto Rico. And then the part that's really fascinating is then he puts out an ambiguous statement about the fact that he's going to work to refound the political party that he belongs to. That's the Popular Democratic Party in Puerto Rico. It is the quote-unquote pro-Commonwealth party. So in their party ideology, they actually don't recognize that Puerto Rico is under the territorial clause of the U.S. Constitution. They believe that in 1952, Puerto Rico was reformed into a quote-unquote Commonwealth, and that somehow it achieved a level of self-government and self-determination that is outside of the territorial clause, that Puerto Rico is no longer a territorial colony. Unfortunately, the only thing that he needs to do to realize that that is not true is actually read the Supreme Court opinions in the case of Sanchez Valle and Vallejo Madero and the Franklin case and
the Aurelius case.
The Aurelius case. So in all of those, the Supreme Court makes it absolutely clear that as great as the 1953 Constitution was in Puerto Rico and how much local power that gave to the government on the island, and the fact that it was called, Commonwealth in the official constitutional name, that didn't change. That Puerto Rico continues to be a territory under the territorial clause of the Constitution, and Congress unincorporated territory, and that Congress continues to hold plenary powers over the island. And then the other piece of information he needs to look to is the fact that we have an oversight board that basically got installed above the constitutional government in Puerto Rico, where you have 7 unelected, unaccountable individuals essentially overturning laws in the government on the island.
Right. And just fun fact, again, the fiscal board, La Junta, it can't be imposed on a state because as its own sovereign, it cannot be imposed on it. The only time that a fiscal board could be imposed is on a territory or a federal district like D.C., because D.C. had a fiscal board as well.
Yeah. So the part that ties this then to his, political party is his political party has failed to recognize this reality for decades. That's part of the reason why their support on the island among the voters has collapsed. And, he's come back with this, shining, younger image that's very reminiscent of his grandfather, Rafael Hernández Colón, which was the former multi-term governor for Puerto Rico and the ideological leader for the Popular Democratic Party. And their whole vision is that they're going to propose an enhanced Commonwealth, a new version of this Commonwealth relationship that they believe still exists, even though the facts don't support it. So it's like he's literally pulling some of the ideology from his grandfather out of the grave as a zombie and trying to give it life again. And when he's asked by a reporter in a podcast, a plain and simple question, define what is this Commonwealth that you aspire to, his answer is, well, we're in the process of refounding the party, and we will give you an answer to that sometime in 2026, and then we'll tell you what it means to support Commonwealth status.
So since the establishment of the Constitution of Puerto Rico in 1952, they've been proposing that they're going to fix the current status, which again, since you're an unincorporated territory, Congress can add those benefits if they want, because you're a territory, or they can take them away.
Yeah.
But like you said, they're just bringing a zombie proposal back to life, not realizing the political and legal reality that like we mentioned, to the Supreme Court cases that Congress debated ad nauseum, that if you are under the territorial clause, regardless of whether you have a constitution, such as we did, which we argued when it was in the Aurelius case that we have our own constitution, you are still an unincorporated territory at the plenary power of Congress, as you mentioned. And that they're trying to do this kabuki dance to be like, oh, we're going to create a new enhanced version. But if you still remain in the territory status, any benefits given to you under that enhanced proposal, if you're still an unincorporated territory, can be stripped away by any subsequent Congress. So you're not changing anything.
Yeah, and you know what, Martín, putting all of the legalistic analysis and all of that aside, let's talk about the human impact. Mm-hmm. The fact that the resident commissioner and his political party can't make up their mind, won't explain what they want, and then they'll do everything to block the will of those who are choosing among the non-territory status option means that, kids in Puerto Rico continue suffering from one of the highest rates of childhood nutrition on the island and childhood poverty. And that's devastating. That's not something abstract. That directly relates to this territory status. And his whole thing is, oh no, well, we want to focus on economic development. Well, guess what? Our economic development is directly tied to the issue of territorial status. I want to improve the, life, living standards and, welfare for people on the island, is one of the things that the resident commissioner keeps harping on. Well, guess what? All of those issues are also directly tied to resolving the territory status. So by continuing to not define what it is that you want and block those that are actually clear on what the legal reality is and are deciding, let's move forward, you're actually perpetuating the inequality that diminishes both the economic opportunity and the standard of living for your very own constituents. And in my view, that is devastating.
It's unfortunate, but that's why, advocates such as yourselves and us, we're going to keep pushing for the voices of Puerto Rico, the will of the majority of the island to be heard here in the halls of Congress.
Definitely, 100%. All right, Martín. So we've been receiving your comments, your questions as viewers and listeners, and we greatly appreciate all of the interactions that you've been doing with our videos. So as part of our commitment to respond to you, we're putting together some of the questions that we received recently and a mailbag section. So let it rip.
All right. So the first question we received was, how does the Jones Act impact Puerto Rico? Can you first describe a little bit about the Jones Act and then go into how it impacts the island?
Sure. So Jones Act is a law in the United States that requires vessels, ships, boats that are transporting cargo from one U.S. port to another to be built in the United States, to be owned by a company from the United States, and be crewed with United States citizens. And that's basically the core essence of the Jones Act. The purpose of it is to make sure that America retains a strong maritime industry, because if we're ever in a circumstance where America's at war, or America gets attacked by other countries, or there's a disruption in the global supply chains because of any other reason, America wants to make sure that it has enough of its own shipping base to be able to supply goods and products and transport them across the ports that go from one U.S. Location to another. Now, the part that is crazy about this issue is that a lot of people think that this means that Puerto Rico can't receive ships that come from other countries to the island, and that's just not the case. Ships from all over the world arrive in Puerto Rico all the time, and they bring all kinds of products and goods. What can't happen under the Jones Act is that those ships stop in Puerto Rico and then go from Puerto Rico to another U.S. port. So that second part would need to happen with a Jones Act ship. And part of what I think is the concern from the opponents of the Jones Act and its application for Puerto Rico is they believe that increases the cost of goods on the island and essentially holds the island under this artificial monopoly that is had by the Jones Act shipping companies that operate and provide those services. But the reality is that the most recent in-depth research that was done on this issue is a report that was published by the U.S. GAO back in 2013. And what that report showed is that there was no clear and compelling evidence of a significant increase in price for shipping services between Puerto Rico and the States because of the fact of the Jones Act. Honestly, in the only place where there was, I believe, was I think in the fact that there weren't Jones Act ships in natural gas. And recently, there was an announcement that a new ship has just been put into service to provide transshipment of natural gas from the island to the States. So, at the end of the day, is there a fundamental challenge with the Jones Act? Those who oppose it believe it's impacting Puerto Rico's economy in a negative way. Those who support it say it's essential to maintain our national security and our shipping industry. We believe that the most important thing is that under the current territory status, we don't have members of Congress that can have a direct say in finding the accurate information so that this debate can be settled. And if any change needs to happen, that change can be implemented. So the most important thing is that we resolve Puerto Rico's territory status so that we have voting members of Congress in the House and Senate, and they can then investigate the issue in full depth and decide if there's any new data beyond what was done in 2013 that merits consideration of a change in policy.
Right, and I believe that one issue that deals with the Jones Act is the dwindling size of our fleet, but that's something that's done through appropriations and to increase the size of the overall fleet, to increase the size of shipments coming in and out of Puerto Rico and other places, such as Hawaii, that are also impacted through the Jones Act. But again, that's an issue that you mentioned we don't have a vote on. Yep. So if we do want to amend the Jones Act, whether we do want to increase our fleet and actually vote, we don't have that vote. We only have to ask people who care about the island in Congress or allies to actually look out for us.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing that I think a lot of people forget about is we have a lot to be thankful for the Jones Act shipping companies. After Hurricanes Irma and Maria, they were the first ones that were on the ground in Puerto Rico, bringing products, bringing water, bringing food, and making sure that people on the island were taken care of. And that's part of the benefit of having that dedicated service. It means that even in moments of extreme distress and challenge, such as in the immediate response to a major natural disaster, you're guaranteed to have a certain service. And, if we were relying on international shipping companies, that may or may not be the case in the future. So, everything has its pros and cons. We want to offer the best information possible, and you can make up your own opinion.
Right. And then just a little bit on that, like when there has been times such as emergencies, Congress has also enacted waivers of the Jones Act to make sure the immediate needs of individuals, either here, Hawaii, or here in Puerto Rico or Hawaii, are met when it comes to those natural disasters.
Yep.
But I think this kind of leads a little bit towards our next question. It's a little bit more political. So do you think that President Trump has any plans in his administration to suggest or comment on Puerto Rico statehood?
You know, it's interesting because President Trump is a very unexpected figure. So I wouldn't rule out any possibility of him dealing with this issue or any other issue. The reality is that it all depends on what he believes is in his best interest in terms of the policies that he's trying to advance in his administration. So we look at the statements that he's made regarding Canada and Greenland. You know, he's talking about America's economic interests. He's talking about America's national security interest. You know, a lot of those same arguments, you know, could be applied to Puerto Rico, and it's possible that it catches his attention in some way. Could the whole effort to bring back manufacturing from the states, from foreign countries back to the states, also be something that brings Puerto Rico to his attention?
With definitely. The reshoring efforts.
Yeah, the reshoring. I mean, that's an area where Puerto Rico is kind of a natural fit into the narrative that he's talking about of bringing manufacturing back to the United States. Are there political considerations for him to bring this issue up? Definitely. We've seen the impact of the Puerto Rican voters stateside have on national presidential level political elections, as well as the upcoming midterms. So Is that possible? Most definitely. You know, whether or not that happens, only time will tell.
All right. I completely agree with you. For this administration to move on this issue, it actually depends on those considerations that might be favorable for either himself or the administration and overall the country. Like, as you mentioned, the reshoring efforts, Puerto Rico would be a great asset to the nation in regards to its reshoring efforts for medical manufacturing, advanced microchip processors. So again, it's just going back to the governor's statement about how she's trying to educate people, not just on the status, on the will of the people, but also the asset that is Puerto Rico, that has been for decades, and how at this time of reshoring efforts, that again, it's a prime jewel in the Caribbean for those efforts. But yeah. So let's move on to our last question. This was a twofer. I noticed that it was the same person that asked two questions, so I combined them into two. Are we paid actors? And are we all right wing? I'll start with that one.
Wow.
No, we're not paid actors, and no, we're not all right wing. I'm a Democrat. Like I mentioned, I was born and raised in Puerto Rico. I went to the Kissimmee, Orlando area. I was raised there, which is like little Puerto Rico if you've ever been. And I've been a Democrat ever since I registered. I worked for Congressman Darren Soto. I worked in a bipartisan fashion throughout my career, but I personally believe this issue, not because of a right-wing or left-wing issue, I feel this is a civil rights issue. And the reason why I mentioned when I worked in Congress is because that's the thing that got me more active in this, is after the people of Puerto Rico voted and how at times I saw their will being disregarded throughout the halls of Congress. And that lit a fire in me to be, no, our people who are U.S. citizens have spoken on this issue. They want full equality. They are demanding full equality. And I just felt at that point, even though the people spoke, they weren't being taken seriously. So to me, personally, it was an issue about this is the will of my people.
Yeah.
This is what they've spoken. And I am not going to let so-and-so or X person disregard it as it's nonsense because, again, this is a democracy. And to disregard not just the will, but the sacrifices of our people for over 126 years, it's the reason why I do this, because I want our will, our democratic voice to be heard in the chambers that impact every facet of our lives on the island. Yeah. We were talking about Medicaid, nutrition, simple representation, and we have no voice. And our people are saying we want to have that voice. So that's why I fight for the equality of the 3.2 million U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico.
Well, thank you for that answer, Martín. I think, for me, it's much the same. This is not something that I'm doing now as part of the Statehood Council, as something that just came out of nowhere. I've dedicated 20 years of my life to addressing the inequalities of Puerto Rico and its people under the current territory status. I've seen how the status issues literally at the root of so many different problems and challenges that the island has. And, it's something personal. Not only have I lived it by working for both Republican and Democratic governors for the island, for Puerto Rico's member of Congress, resident commissioner, so I saw just how limited the resident commissioner was because, we were dealing with, 4 times more constituents than any other member in the House, and we didn't have a floor vote, and we also could only participate in, 2 to maximum 3 committees at most when our issues were being, impacted for island residents across a multitude of different committees. And I also saw just how terrible it was in the Senate to have to beg for other senators to represent you because there's no one there that's accountable directly to the voters in Puerto Rico. And, on an even more personal level, I've experienced having my family feel that they had to leave the island to pursue their dreams and their passions and the quality of life that they deserve. And that means that this is not something that I do out of some ideological fixation or because someone is, paying me to read a script. It's because I've lived the scars of territorial colonialism, and I'm committed to doing everything within my power to make sure that the next generation has a chance to live without that trauma and are empowered to live in a way that really reflects what their vision is for their future, as opposed to the limitations of the chains of territorial colonialism in the past.
Yeah, and that's what we do.
That's right. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for being with us for this episode. We greatly appreciate all of your comments, and we ask you, please, if you like this content, give us a like, share this with your family and friends. Make sure that we can spread the voice to as many people as possible. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great day.